Folks, my name is Bashir Fancy, and I'm the president of Business and Technology Professional Association of Canada, which is both a educational code of ethics certification organization. We are connected to organizations around the world, and we'll be making some big announcements. It's to do with British Computer Society, who we are partnered with, and even Sophia and a couple of others. So that certification. So we'll talk about that later. Today, we have a very important person with us that you see on the screen. It's Hilton Barber, who's actually VP Marketing at Cognitive. A few weeks ago, actually, you would have heard on this platform, Peter Schwartz, who he works very closely with, who actually did a fantastic job along with John Ruffalo, Greg Roccos, and Samir Zabani. That was how you restart the business. One of the most important topics is culture. And Hilton has phenomenal background. If you really look at it, and we'll post when we do the recording on that, you will see why he's eminently qualified to speak on this subject. I believe you've also written books, correct? On this subject.
A number of ebooks, yes. And
I've heard him. You won't be disappointed. Your time today is worth the investment. So I can see on the other side, people are there on YouTube as well. So whether you're watching here or through YouTube, it doesn't matter. Welcome to every single one here in Europe, Middle East, and very big welcome to Hilton, who's been going through some big challenges, by the way. His infrastructure, and I guess we can give credit to the brick store, which we will discuss separately. It might come up here. But actually, there's a lot they could learn in some customer service area. But Hilton can talk about it. So welcome, Hilton. And so you want to park the issue first, then we can go into question answer, or?
Absolutely. Well, Bashir, thank you for this kind invitation, and thank you for the opportunity to speak to the people that are watching us live on YouTube or watching the recording. When we originally spoke, you had asked me, why is the topic of culture so critically important to you? And why is it something that means so much to me? So by way of very quick background, I'll go into that for a moment, and then happy to do the Q&A that you and I have discussed earlier. So I think, quite honestly, my perspective as a seasoned marketer is that culture is the one thing that every organization has, and it is the one thing that is the truest source of competitive advantage. And for me, as a marketing person, constantly seeking out competitive advantage for the clients or organizations I've worked with, over the years, I've come to a recurring thought that culture, the culture of your organization, truly is the source of that competitive advantage. And to put it more plainly, if you have a great culture, the likelihood of your success in the marketplace increases disproportionately. By the same token, if your culture is actually working against you, your culture can be the biggest impediment that your business will face. And for all of us on this call, the notion of winning in the marketplace today couldn't be more pressing for everybody looking to recover from COVID or to succeed in the years ahead. I would suggest, and I look forward to this conversation, that your culture is perhaps the greatest source of your competitive advantage. And I look forward to having that discussion with you this morning.
Fantastic. That's actually super. It actually gets me to one. You already kind of parked the fact that culture, why it's critical to marketer. But one of the things we hear, which I don't buy and I don't think you buy, is that culture is intangible and we can't measure it, or you can't see the impact or whatever. But is that really true?
Well, I would agree that yes, culture is not something that you can directly write on your balance sheet. There isn't a line that says tangible assets and underneath it a line that says culture and you can put a number to it. But I would suggest that there are multitudes of ways that you can see the impact of culture inside your organization, and you can truly measure it. So I would ask you, if things like absenteeism is not something you can measure, if things like employee retention or employee attraction, how hard and how long does it take your organization to fill a job posting? How long do your people stay? And interestingly, I was reading something a couple of days ago that Gallup, the organization who every year talks about employee engagement, and we can talk about that separately, they have pegged a number of $319 billion of lost productivity in the US market based on disengaged and disenfranchised employees. $319 billion. And just as interestingly, that in the same report, they were talking about 1 in 5 employees is actively sabotaging the business that they work for, which I found astounding. But I think for everybody listening in and probably thinking about their own personal experiences, when we talk about sabotaging the business, it can be anything from being disengaged in meetings, taking longer to make decisions. And I would suggest to you that while you may not be able to measure the word culture on your balance sheet, you can absolutely measure the outcomes of having a good culture or having a culture that needs significant transformation.
That is a stunning number at 319 billion, and even the 1 in 5 who sabotage the business. I was aware the security guys working in the organization actually get their payroll there, but they're working for the bad guys, a lot of them. And that recent report is quite stunning. So this is even more staggering, that you almost got a couple of people who are working not in the interest of the organization, which is quite worrying actually. And so in turn, you're measuring the cost. That's pretty stunning. So then the question, are you able to give some examples of companies that have actually embraced technology, right, and become leaders? And how would they go about doing it?
So I think, well, firstly, there's a number of great examples, and certainly one stunning example in the technology field, and that's Microsoft. And I would suggest that for anybody who has followed Microsoft and Microsoft stock in particular, since Satya Nadella joined as CEO in 2014, you will see a classic hockey stick growth of the Microsoft organization in terms of performance, in terms of relevance, and in terms of what they've been able to achieve in the marketplace. And I would suggest that if you're following Satya Nadella himself, you will see that time and again, he has put culture, the culture of Microsoft, at the very center of that transformation. In fact, he's gone so far as writing a book called Hit Refresh, which I would strongly encourage everybody in the technology field to pick up. But it is a brilliant example of an organization that prior to his arrival was floundering, a stock price that had plummeted. But in 6 relatively short years, Microsoft has gone on to become one of the titans in the technology space again. And again, I would say Satya Nadella as CEO and his complete commitment to culture and culture transformation inside that organization has been a significant accelerant of that. That's perhaps the best example. I can certainly give you a litany of examples on the other side. And I think the most recent examples, or everyone on this phone call would probably remember, Travis Kalanick at Uber, again, is a classic example of a culture that in essence created such a dumpster fire inside that organization that they lost significant marketplace value, they lost significant talent, and they certainly lost significant perception in the marketplace. More recently, WeWork, again, a classic example of an organization, and we can debate the merits of their business model, But the reality is their culture, the culture of leadership at that organization, has been shown to be a direct contributor to the significant loss and absolute decimation of that organization's market valuation. So if you ask me, does culture have a business impact? Absolutely right. You want to see it done positively? I would look to Microsoft. You want to see it done poorly? I would look to Uber, I would look to WeWork, and I would look to several others. And sadly, they seem to be coming up in the news more frequently than perhaps any of us would want.
Although it's been a while, I'm wondering if Kodak would have fit into this, because they were a $136 billion company. They were leaders in cameras, right? And what happened?
Well, Kodak's a wonderful example, and not surprisingly, a brilliant business case example for those who go through MBA school. The interesting thing about Kodak, and everybody will talk about how they missed the boat. The irony is the story, as I'm led to believe, is that Kodak actually had the technology for digital photography inside their organization already. And that because of internal pressure, that particular innovation never saw the light of day at Kodak. And actually the powers that be at Kodak said, we don't want to kill our current business model and our current business products because of this thing that you're proposing. So again, I would point to a classic moment in business history where the culture of an organization actually created its own impediments, where the culture of Kodak at the time created either its own level of bureaucracy or put up its own walls to save itself. But in the end, actually, they themselves were the reason for their demise. It's a fascinating story about Kodak, particularly because that innovation that could have saved them and kept them relevant already existed inside their culture and inside their organization, but they couldn't unlock it. It's an amazing story, and an amazing story.
Yeah, because we all own Kodak, even to an extent, the name is used sometimes in vain now because they don't exist. They're gone. And 3D technologies, it's quite mind-boggling. In just a spin on that a little bit, I know we have not talked about this, but the fact that some comments I read this morning about the issue around innovation, all that the brand, which is really the promise, the trust, right? Is not getting impacted by this issue as well?
Absolutely. And again, this is why as a marketer, culture to me is such a critical part of a marketing role done well. And there's a lot of conversation around who should be responsible for culture inside an organization. Historically, obviously, it's been the chief people officer or the chief human resources person. But much like your brand is the responsibility of everybody inside your organization. I would suggest that culture is also something to whom everybody inside your organization is responsible as well. Now that can be a very hard concept, but I would say the responsibility of leadership at an organization is to make crystal clear their expectations of the culture, their expectations of the behaviors of their people. Because the simplest definition I've ever come across for culture is how people act, behave, and make decisions in order to fit in. And I think as everybody listening on this phone, on this call would attest, that if you know how to act, if you know how to behave, and ultimately you know how decisions are made inside your organization, you have a great understanding of the culture. My question to everybody is, how do people act and behave and make decisions inside your organization? And more importantly, is that moving your organization forward, or is that causing your organization to fall behind and falter? That is something that everybody inside an organization should be able to do and should be able to recognize and debate.
So that's actually very interesting, which now takes me, there's a fair bit of talk about technologies company talk about cultures, and you've given one macro. What are your thoughts here generally for the rest?
Well, so let me briefly come back to that definition of culture.
Right.
Your culture is how your people act, behave, and make decisions to fit in. That is your culture. Sadly, the definition of culture is probably so amorphous or so poorly understood across the marketplace that for many people, when they talk about culture, they will talk about it in terms of the sheer density of foosball tables in their open plan offices. They will talk about their culture in terms of vegan muffins in the cafeteria. And certainly our friends in Silicon Valley have spent the last decade talking about how wonderful their facilities are and bring your dog to work and all these great things. And I would suggest those are great. Those are great about the environment or the climate of the organization that you work in. But it's not more critically about how decisions are made. That is what your culture is. How do decisions get made inside your organization? Here's perhaps a classic example. If an organization says to you, good ideas can come from anywhere, and the first time somebody speaks up who isn't an SVP and been at the company for 10 years, how is that person received? How is that idea received? Are they even given a voice? So again, I would come back to, you can look around your organization and ask yourself, when somebody has a great idea that may be a bit different, is it encouraged or stifled? When somebody speaks up in a meeting, do people take a moment to listen and understand the idea, or tell them to keep quiet? When somebody raises a customer complaint, do people immediately jump into action and say, how can we solve that customer issue? Or do they say, that's not my department, that's not my responsibility, I can't help? Again, I would say to everybody listening to this recording and on this phone, think about the last 10 meetings you had inside your organization and think about how decisions were made, how voices were heard or stifled, and whose voices were important. That will give you a very quick sense of how your culture is.
Actually, that's very interesting because people don't speak up. We've seen that. And culturally, there may be already a cultural issue about your senior says something goes.
Yeah.
And I have experienced that absolutely. In fact, one of the things I'm thinking about, which you can expand on, is umpteen years ago. I didn't want to name a company, but let's say a very large airline spent few $1 million in customer service to improve the customer service at the airports and wherever. This gentleman missed his flight because 401 was jammed and so forth. So gets to the airport, missed the flight by 10 minutes, and the check-in agent says, sorry, your flight's gone, stand on one side, give me a credit card, I'll give you a new ticket, or you can't fly. There were 30 flights, 30 seats empty on the next flight, which was just going within an hour. And I happened to be there. It is ridiculous. When you close the door of the aircraft, that seat is gone. But this guy's paid. This guy's paid. What had happened, the millions of dollars of this rule were rules, right? Were rules rather than empowering the person at the gate, at the check-in, to say, he's paid, legitimate reason, make a decision. It turned out to be a top executive, one of the companies where the airline was trying to get the business from. And it's just,
Yeah.
so you have such example of how would you deal with this problem?
So unfortunately, I don't have a silver bullet. So for those on this call looking for a silver bullet, unfortunately, I do not. Because here's the other thing about your culture. And here's why it's a competitive advantage. Your culture inside your organization is distinctly yours. There is no other organization in the world who has your culture. They don't have your heritage. They don't have your founders. They don't have the 5 or 25 years of decisions you have made to build and create the culture that you have. So again, when I come back to your culture as a competitive advantage, it is because you and the culture you have inside your company is distinctly yours. Now, I would come, if I look at the example that you just gave, Bashir, and it's a great example, it's a classic example that I'm sure there's 500 others that could have bubbled up in the comment section already on this YouTube video. The reality is that notion, or that historical notion of a deeply hierarchical organization where decision-making centers on 5 people at the very top of the food chain and is not distributed to the point of customer. Because there are retail, and retail is a brilliant example. Retail, travel, and hospitality are world-class examples of cultures who recognize that the person standing across from your customer has to be empowered to do the right thing by that customer at that moment. I look at a glorious Canadian example, and go Canada, but the Four Seasons Hospitality Group is a world-class example of recognizing the importance of building a culture where the person interacting with the customer gets to make the rules in that moment. And again, I can appreciate how some organizations may not want to provide that level of empowerment. I can understand that, but that is a choice that they get to make. But there are great examples. I said the Four Seasons. I would suggest Southwest Airlines is another great example. I would suggest in Canada, WestJet is another great example of an organization who genuinely lives customer centricity in their culture. And that is something driven by culture and decisions that they have made at the most senior executive levels.
I think you just give the answer. It's empowering. It's empowering the people. And that's a cultural problem of not doing that, because few people are keeping the decision making at their level, whatever. Which then brings very interesting question, because there's a lot of talk going on in the industry about digital transformation. These days, you look at it, and everybody's talking about digital transformation. I know you've written quite a lot about this topic.
Yeah, I have indeed.
Can you throw some light on this?
Absolutely. And the interesting thing about digital transformation, and again, it's been borne out, the industry in general has been talking about digital transformation for over a decade. Unfortunately, digital transformation, much like culture, is a word that has become so amorphously defined that people throw it around for everything as simple as, we are standing up an e-commerce site. That is a digital transformation. Okay, maybe. Or we are fundamentally changing our retail organization. A classic example yesterday was the launch of Walmart Plus, a direct toe-to-toe competitor to Amazon Prime, and one that I will very definitely be looking very closely at to see how they evolve in the months ahead. But the reality is digital transformation, time and again, has become something where people are enamored about the technology, What is the technology going to do? And time and again, they forget that it's people, the people inside their organization, who have to transform alongside the technology, the tools, and the utilities that have just been unlocked. It doesn't matter if your e-commerce site is stood up, if the people delivering the goods to the home of that customer aren't connected in and don't care about customer service. So again, and I'm going to show this to everybody that's on the call. A wonderful book, if you've not read, by Tony Saldana, previously at Procter & Gamble, wrote a book unambiguously titled Why Digital Transformations Fail. And in 250 plus pages, the recurring theme is digital transformations fail because of an inability for the organization to change and adapt. And specifically, the people inside the organization's ability to change and adapt. And in a recent conversation I had with Tony, he said, the short answer is digital transformations fail because of the inability to align with the culture of the organization as it is today, or the culture needed for the transformation to succeed. And he is a gentleman who has worked globally at one of the most respected organizations on the planet and has seen firsthand the impact of culture on digital transformation. So I would come back to those who believe that digital transformation is an exercise in technology are missing the substantial impact that their people and their culture has on its success.
You know, it's very powerful what you just said. It reminds me of, if technology people are listening here, what Hilton just described is you have a fundamental old system, people like to call it legacy, but you don't go fix it. You put a graphic user interface on top of that, but you never change your bottom line. It's still the thought process that is just that you keep translating back to your old thinking, right? And that does not work very well. It's incredible what you just put out there. It's very powerful. So tied to that, do the tech firms actually get the culture piece right?
That's a great question, Bashir. I mean, I don't know the technology firms that are listening and watching this, so I would firstly hope that you could look around your organization, people who are on this call, and think about, is the culture that I am part of accelerating my potential to help this business succeed? Ask yourself that personal question. The skills that I have as an individual inside my organization, do I feel that I can bring them to this organization every day in a meaningful way? Do I know what I contribute? Do I know how my contribution, stumbled over that, how my contribution is measured and valued? Do you know that? And does your organization provide an environment where those skills can be unleashed? Bashir, we talked the other day about 3M.
Yes.
And a wonderful conversation that I had maybe 7 or 8 years ago, where the director of innovation for 3M said that his entire job, success for him, was increasing the share of shower time he could create for his team. What a bizarre phrase, share of shower. So inevitably I asked him, what do you mean by that? And he said, where do you think historically the greatest ideas come to people? Standing in the shower in the morning, in my case, singing very poorly and out of tune. But the greatest ideas typically come stereotypically while you're in the shower. And he said, if I can create an environment where my people are thinking in the shower about our business challenges, about our creative ideas. If I can get them to do that for 5 minutes more, imagine the brilliant ideas that my people will be able to bring into the office. So for me, this is this gentleman speaking. For me, my role is to increase the share of shower time for my employees. And I thought, what a wonderful visual way to think about the power of your culture and your leaders to create a place where people can think creatively and can bring their gifts, their talent, their skills to help the organization succeed.
That actually is very powerful, and this actually challenges the issues around. I think what you talked about is we've had the culture in the corporate world of if it's not invented here, it doesn't fly. At the highest level, in other words,
Yeah,
it's my way or the highway. In fact, I was given a term long time, and to be fair, I used it a couple of times, but it's not a, which basically said that if I want your opinion, I'll give it to you.
yeah.
And that's the way it's been working, right?
Well, Bashir, I'll jump ahead to the conversation you and I have had several times over the last few weeks.
Right.
Which is the increasing conversation around people saying, I want an innovation culture. And certainly within the technology arena, that is a very fair aspiration for every organization, particularly now in COVID, where everybody is looking very hard at their business models. They're looking very hard at how they create demand, how they create growth for their organizations in this global pandemic. But the interesting thing is, there is no such thing as an innovation culture. An innovation culture is not a thing. Innovation really is an output. Much like profit is an outcome of running your business well, innovation is an outcome of having a culture that allows innovation to flourish. It's as simple as that. You don't have an innovation culture per se, but you do have a culture that respects new ideas, that allows latitude for failure, that deeply embodies learning, continuous learning, both internally and externally. Those are attributes of your culture. And for anyone who works in the innovation space, they would say those are absolute basics that are required for new ideas to come up. Again, I read an interesting quote the other day from another excellent book called The Technology Fallacy. And for those, The Technology Fallacy. In that book, there was a classic quote that said, you cannot have a Six Sigma level of fault inside an innovation culture. The reason being is, for those who are Six Sigma black belts on this call, that is a 0.634% failure rate. How can innovation flourish in a place that would only allow 0.634% of failure? It would never happen. So again, I would respectfully suggest to those on this recording who are saying they want an innovation culture, I would say to them, recalibrate and look at your culture and say, could innovation flourish or fail inside our organization today? Because if it flourishes, innovation will be the natural outcome. And that's what you would want.
This is very powerful, what you just put out there, for a couple of reasons. The way we are structured today, organizations, we created profit centers and so forth. Mm-hmm. And one will succeed, but their moves may undermine another area in business, but they don't care about it because it doesn't really make any difference. Their objectives are tied, right, literally, to. You want to speak on that issue, because I think
again, I mean, Bashir, I think you and I, either with a bottle of single malt scotch and a long weekend, could probably unpack many of these things.
Plenty on this,
and
yes.
Certainly, and I would gladly relish the opportunity right now for a glass of single malt scotch. The interesting thing is, and I think organizations, particularly now in COVID, where people are working from home, where that environment of the office, where we could bring 10 people together, shove them in a boardroom, lock the door and say, do not come out until you have a solution. That's gone virtual. And just as we're having this conversation now, and it's a rich conversation, it's a whole bunch more difficult, especially for all of us as we're learning these new skills, to collaborate in this world we're currently living in. So that to me suggests that you're absolutely right. Historically, organizations have, and not out of malice or any ill intent, have created structures and instituted reward and recognition that has done what? Reinforced the behaviors around them. And I would suggest, talking with a dear friend last week, he said the interesting conversation being had inside his organization at the moment is around people being compensated on revenue or on margin. It's two very simple concepts, and again, around reward and recognition, you can see how that could very quickly bubble to the surface. But the interesting thing is, he said, we have some people who, we've recently hired, or he's now gone on to be the team leader of, who we hired from other organizations that were based on revenue numbers. He's historically been rewarded on margin. So immediately, a small but probably quite poignant example of reward and recognition structures are a powerful mechanism for driving behavior. And that, again, is an outcome of your culture. What are some of those mechanisms? And how do people fit in? So again, I would ask you, the Microsoft example I gave you earlier of Satya Nadella. There is a classic cartoon that you can find on the internet, which a gentleman had created visuals of the organizing structure of every one of the big technology firms. And the amusing thing, perhaps not for an employee of Microsoft at the time, but that organizational structure had all sorts of handguns drawn into it to symbolize that operating structure at the time was about, my division can only succeed if your division fails. Now, I was not an employee of the organization. I can't speak to how deeply embedded that was in the culture. But I've got to say, if somebody can draw a cartoon of your organizational structure like that and see it shared hundreds of thousands of times on the internet, you've got to think that there's a grain of truth in it. And again, I would say, is your organization internally set up for collaboration or competition? Because I would suggest right now, collaboration, not competition, is what's going to power your organization's forward.
Again, yet another powerful point, because I think a lot of the corporations do work in, that's where the silos come in. And I will never forget when I joined Air Canada, which is a really, really long time ago. Mm-hmm. And the boss at the time, because it was civil service, it was not it was owned by the government, told me, if I don't hear anything about you, you're doing a very good job. Well, what the heck does that mean? That means don't do anything, and you'll get your pay.
Don't upset the apple cart.
Absolutely, is what he said to me.
Don't upset the apple cart.
To my question about can I do this, he gave me close to 18-page answer. Go ahead, no, don't go ahead. Go ahead, don't go ahead. Whichever way I went, I was in trouble because he was. And I thought to myself, what the heck? So I just wrote him a half a page. I understood this to be go ahead. I'm proceeding. If you don't agree, then just tell me no. So that way he didn't have a answer to stop me. But it's kind of ridiculous. That's what is in fact happening, is that we have somebody benefits because the other person has failed. That is still alive and kicking. And you look at our and in fact it contributes. This what you brought up a couple of, and I'm just trying to fit into one of the areas. What you just said is that if you look at corporate world, we know that 60 to 65% of the data is duplicate, right? And so we ask ourselves, why is that happening? Is because everybody wants to keep their own data to literally run their own profit center, but the organization as a whole is going to get compromised. You got multiple points of failure, multiple points of exposure. They don't think about that because it's, I want control. So that's a very powerful point you just put out there. The culture issue, one of the things in Canada in the business, and I think John Ruffalo, Peter Schwartz, and the rest actually talked about it, is we have a culture of not taking risks in business, right? And you can even see that at the Canadian government level, right? Which is quite worrying, that you would think they would be doing things, because we have a chance now to be in global leadership role if we play it right. What are your views on that? About
well, certainly, I think it would be very easy to paint a broad generalization of Canadian industry to say we're not risk takers. I think there's some truth in that. But by the same token, I look at the gentleman that you just talked about, John Ruffalo, Peter Schwartz, Bruce Croxon. I mean, there is levels. Toby at Shopify. I mean, we have some of the most incredible technology entrepreneurs and passionate technology investors in this country. I mean, let's look at Alcatel, let's look at Nortel, let's look at BlackBerry, let's look at Descartes. I mean, let's look at Shopify. Shopify going toe-to-toe with Amazon, and I would suggest, and winning in many ways. So it's not that we don't take risks, and it's not that we're not innovative in this country. I think the reality is there is still a shyness, perhaps. And maybe that's a terrible word to use, but the reality is, again, is your culture one that is about embracing risk? And with risk comes a degree of failure. It's inevitable. I don't think anybody bats 100%. They'd probably be worth $500 million in the Major League Baseball if they did. But even the best batsmen in Major League Baseball don't do much over 400. So I would suggest, again, it comes back to what is the risk tolerance of our organizations, of our leadership. And again, with respect, I might suggest we are facing a global pandemic that has leveled entire industries and entire countries. Unlike the financial episode of 2008, this is a universal impact. And I would suggest that organizations probably don't have a better time to try something new than right now. Because doing nothing will, I would say respectfully, be the end of your business. If you're not prepared to double down now, lower your risk tolerance. Be more prepared and more accepting of failure, but see it as an opportunity to accelerate to your point of success. You may, as a leader, have missed the most golden opportunity of the last 20 years. And I would suggest the source of that accelerant is the culture and the leadership you currently have.
I should have asked my question a little better. You're right in that instead of Canadians, I would have sort of broken into two categories. The people you referred to are, because they are risk takers, they are founders. They have founded their own companies, right?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
The leaders that I was referring to are the one who inherited, and banks are a very good example, because they didn't create the bank, they inherited. A lot of the large organizations, whether it be airline, whatever, different business. And I think that's where that culture is still alive and kicking, whereas the likes of John Ruffalo, Bruce Coxon, Peter Schwartz, or Greg Rocos, all those guys created that because they were confident enough. And yes, they are more than just Canadian leaders. I think they are global leaders, right?
Agreed. Agreed.
And I think that's so you're right, absolutely. But we could create more. The government's role is not to create success or failure. The government's role is to create the rails, and then people, use that. And I think that's what needs to change. In maybe it's changing to some extent, but not to the extent needed, right?
But Bashir, again, and for international attendees, apologies for this conversation that's very Canadian-centric right now. But we have a Minister of Innovation, Navdeep Bains. We have a gentleman designated by the Canadian government to be an accelerant of innovation in this country. So that is somebody designated with that role. And my question would be, is that minister and the culture inside his ministry driven to help lower the risk tolerance of Canadian business and create a culture across industry in Canada where Canadian innovation can thrive? They are a contributor to that culture. They are an active contributor to creating the environment where innovation can flourish. So I would say the government in Canada and in every country across the world does have a significant role to play in allowing industry in that country to be more innovative. And they need to look to the levers that they have to be accelerants of it. And in fact, I might suggest they need to look to the culture of their ministry to see if they're an example of how innovation can flourish or fail. So again, I wouldn't let the ministry and their culture off the hook. They have a culture too that will perpetuate the decisions that they make. So my question is, do those ministries have a culture of innovation or not?
I think your message comes through loud and clear. And a couple of days ago, CBC had an article that the government in Canada, and I guess the ministry we're referring to, keep going to the US tech giants when you have people in Canada that could do that much better. In fact, 5% of the time they go to Canadian companies, 95% of the time they keep going south of the border. So there's a mind block there that we can't do it, which is ridiculous because that's not true, right?
Well, I think we've listed 5 or 6 technology entrepreneurs with a track record of success on this call alone.
Right.
And that took you and I less than 30 seconds.
Yes.
If we go back to that bottle of scotch in a couple of hours, I imagine we could fill pages with Canadian organizations, Canadian entrepreneurs, Canadian leaders who absolutely have world-class potential. That our government should be doing everything in their power to light a fire under them and let those organizations succeed. But I would, with respect, say that's probably a topic for another call at another time.
And when we are going to do it, because I've realized there's a hell of a lot here more that we won't be able to cover on all this. But one quick thing that would be helpful is the corporate world giving up a lot of this success because they're looking for perfection versus progress, because the culture is not going to happen overnight. The leaders have to lead by example and do all those wonderful things. So you start to accept little bites and you start to move in that direction. Are we looking for perfection instead of progress?
Again, Bashir, it's an excellent question, and one that is impossible for me to comment on an individual level. Because again, innovation, the definition of innovation is probably different in every organization that is represented on this call.
Right.
And, you know, for those who are familiar with Clay Christensen, the the Harvard Business School professor, who wrote essentially all the classic books on innovation, he would talk about, is this disruptive innovation or is this incremental innovation? And again, I think the environment inside your organization needs to have a clear definition of which innovation are we driving for. Because if it's incremental, that's a different set of evaluations. If it's disruptive, again, I would suggest you need an environment with a higher tolerance for failure, because disruptive by its very nature means you're entirely upsetting the apple cart. So again, if there's a theme throughout a lot of our conversation today, it is the amorphous definition of some very critical terms inside your organization needs to be addressed and needs to be communicated universally to all of your people. How do we define culture in our organization? How do we define innovation inside our organization? What is the definition of digital transformation for our organization? I think the struggle that leaders have, and by extension the people that work with them, is if those definitions are fuzzy, you will get very well-intentioned people working at cross purposes because their own individual definition will not be the same as the definition of their colleagues. So they may not be actively sabotaging their company, as we talked about at the beginning, but they could be inadvertently sabotaging their company because they are using the wrong definition, or a definition that is not aligned to the organization's strategy and to the direction the leadership is looking to drive.
That's interesting. I thought there was a question, but there's a comment actually from Bob, which is basically saying the culture in the innovation government agency is obvious. It's time to have the house cleaned out. Okay.
Well, I appreciate your comments, and I would imagine the next time there's a municipal or federal election, you will cast your vote accordingly.
Yes, exactly.
I certainly appreciate the comment.
You know, one of the things that you just talked about, and we talked about how the organization needs to get structured. Directly or indirectly, is the culture that's impacting? Is a good question. We talk about privacy and security, and they're both the flip side of the same coin. You can't have privacy without security. You can't have security without privacy. Yet, structurally, you got the chief privacy officer reporting to the legal counsel.
Of course, yes.
And you got the security chief information security officer reporting to the CIA. They don't talk to one another. Yet you can't have one without the other. And it's weird how it's, because it's how it was structured a long time ago, and they don't go back to it to look at, to say, do we need to, and what you're saying is take a step back in a sense to understand what your challenges are in the business, right? Which does not require making, one of the things that will help the culture is putting customer number one.
that is certainly one approach. And I think at the risk of sounding like a guy who merchandises T-shirt slogans, I would suggest that a very simple way of looking at it is your strategy, your business strategy, is the engine of your possible success. But executing your strategy requires your culture to be aligned. So if your strategy is the engine and you think of your culture as the fuel that drives that engine, is it high performance fuel, or is it fuel that's mixed with a bit of sugar that's going to clog up your engine and prevent it from working? So again, there are perhaps hundreds of organizations represented on this call today, and each of them will have their own unique strategy. But the question I would pose to them, and you talked about it there in terms of the organizational design and reporting structures,
right,
would be to say, do we have a clear and cogent strategy? What does that require to succeed of our culture? What is the type of talent? What is the type of aspiration? What is the type of decisions we need to encourage inside this organization? And those will differ from a retailer selling T-shirts to a national airline to a Schedule A bank. Those will be entirely different. And then third would be, what is the organizational design that allows those decisions to be made more effectively, more efficiently, and more in line with the strategy? And I think, or my concern would be, where organizations think that doing an organizational design exercise, where you talk about reporting structures, before you do a culture exercise that says, where do we need decisions to be made and how do we need them to be made, can be where you can struggle. So if I was being a purist, I would suggest it always starts with your strategy, aligning your culture to that strategy to understand the culture you need and the decision-making you need, and then look to how you design your organization to enable the culture to thrive at the very best of its potential. That would be the order and the sequencing of events and the way that I would line up those three very critical aspects of any organization.
I think, again, a very powerful point you made is we have a tendency to take a person we like, to put him in a job and create a job around him, rather than understanding what the needs of the jobs are, and then looking at the other side to see who's got the skills, and then on how we can beef it up and then put him. So today we have round pegs in square hole and square and round hole in the financial institutions and all over the place. So, as
well, Bashir, So Bashir, I think, again, what you're pointing out, I think, is quite accurate, which is having a look at the capabilities inside your organization. Objectively, what are the capabilities inside your organization? And how do they need to be aligned to our success? And more importantly, what does that capability require in order to be successful? I would say with affection, I have worked inside organizations with some really brilliant, creative, wonderful, passionate people who are stifled by where they are in the organization, or how they report, or whom they report to, or what they are responsible for. So again, and it's very simple for me to say, as obviously a huge proponent of culture as a differentiator, that the sequence of events would always be, what is the strategy for success to win in the marketplace? What is the culture you require to enable that success to occur? And how does your organization need to be designed in order for that creativity, that innovation, that wonderful talent of your people to be directed and importantly, unleashed so your business can be successful?
Absolutely fantastic. What you just laid out, how the structure in you given as we close, but we'll have to do another session because there are 2 or 3 notes I made. There's a lot of drill down now required. You talked about the Kodak failure, not because they didn't have a good business or versus the Satya Nadella success as to how and why the reset, refresh button is critical for the business. What you just recapped about the strategy, and then structuring accordingly. We've talked about the innovation doesn't happen by itself. You create a culture that creates innovation. So innovation is not a thing unto itself. It's a result of, right? Having the right culture.
Correct.
Right.
Correct.
As is security. For example, you won't get security. It's you doing all the right things. And I think culture, it plays a very big role in that too. People underestimate.
Absolutely.
Yeah, if people are listening today and heard this carefully, you realize how critical culture is in organizations. Because if you don't get that right, you are not going anywhere. It's also the mindset, as we call it. And we talked about the people just in 20, 30 seconds. We had 5, 6 names right off the bat, or maybe even 5 seconds. Is the difference? Why were they successful? Why is John Ruffalo, Peter Schmort able to think like that and do this? What is the difference here, right? And it's that is the thing. Why a bank can't think like that? I mean, they are in this space, and then you look at the experience that you had. I won't repeat that, but people, if you're on LinkedIn,
no need to repeat it.
Yeah, LinkedIn, you can look at and you'll find out exactly what we went through, because I went through the same problem with the same company, and so did many others. What is the root cause of that? And it's exactly comes back to culture, right? If they understood that. So I think there's some very powerful thing here for people who are listening, or who may either have missed it or listening. We're recording it. I would recommend you play it back again, because there's some really fantastic stuff along the line that Hilton is parked all over the place, because you may have missed it. That you want to hear that, and I promise you, we're going to do part 2 and part 3, whatever as required, because this is too critical a subject that you can't necessarily just cover in 1 hour. But it's packed some really good things. If you've got questions, fire it in, either to Hilton, to myself at info@BizTek, BizTek.org. And I promise you, October, whenever Hilton is available sometime, we'll do part 2, because there's stuff that I've just made quick notes here that require a lot of drilling down, as he's quite rightly pointed out. He's even pointed out a couple of books that may be worth reading, because of the fact that it may make you think differently. We need to get out of this mindset that we got everything under control. No, we don't. And you need to
Absolutely.
You need to do
Absolutely.
things. Yeah. So Hilton, thank you. Unless you want to add something I may have missed in recapping.
Well, for anybody who's on this call and wants to reach out on LinkedIn, please do. I look forward to picking up the conversation there if you're interested. And I do want to take a moment to thank Bashir and his colleague Derek Lacey for everything that they are doing. This call is but one of a series of calls with Canadian business and technology leaders. And I couldn't endorse and advocate for the work that they are doing inside BizTek, for what Canada needs and what Canadian entrepreneurs and businesses need right now. So Bashir, it has been a delight and a privilege to spend time with you today. And thank you for everything that you are doing for your organization. The world does need more Canada.
Yes, absolutely. And we are there. I could have had my Canadian flag, which is on the other side this time. But absolutely, this is a Canadian contribution, and we will do a lot more. We do it because of the passion, and you saw passion on Hilton's side and our side. So we're going to promise you do more, a lot more. And a lot of the things, this video is going to be on our site, biztek.org, biztek.org. And we will do more, I promise you, with with Hilton as we have promised you, and he just committed to. So looking forward. Thank you very much that you were able to do what you did this morning.
My pleasure.
With the type of challenges you went through. So that's incredible. So
my pleasure.
God bless. I'll send you the recording. We'll put it out there hopefully by the afternoon.
Bashir, thank you for your time. Thank you for the great questions. You have yourself a magnificent day.
Thank you. All the very best. Take care. All the best. Cheers.